Welcome back to Aizawa Podfics. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 6 and 7 of Your Presence is a Dream in This Godforsaken Nightmare by Chaotic Bitch 033. I'm so sorry I've been gone for so long. It's been a sick week for me. Sore throat, stuffy nose, you know the drill. Can't really speak when I'm that sick. So, here is what you've all been waiting for. Chapter 6. Wax wings melt eventually. Summary: Izuku and Aizawa get a break. For now. Aizawa and Izuku were, for the most part, left alone over the next few weeks. On occasion, a guard would pull Aizawa out of the cell for the occasional checkup, which consisted of simple blood tests, physical examinations, and other suspiciously normal medical practices. But that was it. No more torture. Izuku was left to heal, recovering his strength slowly, day after day, and Aizawa took care of him as best he could. After what must have been 2 full weeks, Izuku was speaking again, joking around with Aizawa and questioning him relentlessly about anything hero-related. He was still mostly bedridden, but far more energetic than he had ever been after Overhaul. Izuku hadn't told Aizawa about the man, unable to form the words. Aizawa never pressed him about it either, which almost made things worse. Izuku knew he needed to tell Aizawa, to warn him, but every time he tried, all he could think about was pain, pain, pain. And his throat would close and his heart would race, and he couldn't do it. But they were managing okay. Now that they were left to their own devices, during this period of inactivity, Izuku and Aizawa found their own ways to pass the time. They drew each other pictures and played silly games, often spending hours just talking to one another. One night, after a competitive few rounds of tic-tac-toe, Izuku had won, Izuku approached Aizawa with something that had been on his mind for a while. Aizawa, Izuku started hesitantly. Do you think you could train me to fight? I think it would help us later down the line if I knew how to fight, too. And you're really good with self-defense. Of course you are. You're a Eraserhead, for fuck's sake. That's pretty much your whole brand. Not that you can't do other things or anything. Aizawa cut off his ramblings with a soft chuckle. Izuku stopped, tips of his ears feeling warmer than usual. Of course I'll train you, kid. It's going to be tough work, but we'll take it slow. Right now, though, you need to rest. It's illogical to try and work right now when your body is still recovering. Izuku's heart soared. He dreamt of a pro hero training him ever since he was a little kid, but he never thought it would actually happen, let alone with Eraserhead. Thank you so much, Eraserhead. Sorry, Aizawa. I'm still trying to get used to it. You don't have to call me Aizawa. Whatever you're comfortable with is fine. Izuku looked at the man in surprise. Once again, he was in awe over how laid back and kind Eraserhead Aizawa really was. He looked down at his hands, contemplative. After everything the hero had done for him, everything he had seen, it was only fair that he would refer to the man with some sense of familiarity. When you were still having trouble speaking, you would call me Zawa sometimes. I figured it was easier to say my full name if you want. I figured it was easier than saying my full name if you want. You can call me that. Izuku started, his cheeks blazing as he waved his hands frantically. I'm so sorry. I wasn't really thinking. I was just so out of it, and your hero name was so hard to say. Oh god, that's so embarrassing. Looking up at Aizawa, Izuku could see a glint of amusement in the man's usually impassive eyes. Over the past few weeks together, Izuku had gotten better at reading the man, and right now, he was clearly playing with him. Izuku stopped his rambling, fixing the underground hero with a angry look that was really just a pout. That's so mean. I'm going to call you Zawa now, just because you were teasing me. That finally got a laugh out of the hero. It was quiet and short, but genuine. It surprised Izuku, but he recovered quickly, laughing with Aizawa. You and my husband would get along great. He's always on my ass about making fun of him. Aizawa's tone was fond, but his eyes were sad. The light-hearted mood in the room shifted, tinged with a sense of sorrow that Aizawa rarely showed. He blinked rapidly, inhaling deeply before trying to change the subject. Anyways, why don't we... What's he like? Izuku's voice was soft, his eyes understanding. Aizawa looked at him for a moment, his eyes glossy, before glancing down, taking another deep breath. He's my sunshine. He's my everything, and so much more. The hero's usually stoic voice was thick with affection. He's loud and vibrant and way too energetic, especially in the morning. He's great with kids and is the kindest person I've ever known. You would love him, and I know he would love you too. Aizawa finally glanced Izuku's way, tears gone from his eyes as he schooled his expression. Izuku knew he was trying to be strong, trying to act like a hero, but he wished that Aizawa just let himself hurt, let himself feel. He'd work on it with him. Izuku promised himself. But Aizawa had already changed topics, guiding the conversation skillfully to something Izuku couldn't possibly ignore. In fact, you probably already know of him. He's a hero, just like me. I bet you could figure out who he is. Izuku's eyes lit up. He knew it was a diversion tactic, but it was working. Just when he thought Aizawa couldn't get any cooler, he found out that the man is married to another pro hero. Izuku literally couldn't think of anything that amazing. You're married to a pro hero? That's so cool! The corners of Aizawa's mouth twitched upwards as he nodded. Izuku thought about what Aizawa had said, searching his brain for every hero he could think of. Okay, so he's loud and energetic, obviously male. I'm assuming he's an above-ground hero? Izuku's question was met with another nod. Well, I'm gonna say it's not All Might at that, Aizawa snorted, both out of humor and disgust. So that leaves, well, not many male pro heroes are known for having that much exuberance, let's just say. Oh, you said he's loud? Maybe someone who works with his voice? Kind, energetic, good with kids? Don't tell me you're married to the voice hero, Present Mike. Bingo. Are you serious? That's awesome. I never would have guessed. He's just so, well, he's like the sun. But I guess that would make you his moon. Oh my god, I can't believe you're married to Present Mike. He's one of my favorite heroes. He did a segment on quirkless discrimination on his talk show, and he was so understanding and kind, not to mention. Aizawa's eyes had gone wide, and Izuku trailed off. You okay, Zawa? Yeah, I just never thought about it that way. You're a real smart kid, you know that? The compliment stole the air from Izuku's lungs. For a moment, he thought Aizawa was joking, but with one look at the hero, Izuku knew that he wasn't. I'm not... Really, it's not... Izuku stumbled over his words, trying to think of something to say. Aizawa just watched, his expression unreadable. I'm pretty average, I think. I mean, my grades were always kind of bad, so, I wouldn't call myself smart, he mumbled, gaze falling to his hands. Smart. Aizawa had called him smart. But he wasn't smart. He knew that he wasn't, because that's what everyone at school told him. What his mother always reminded him of. Well, I think you're pretty smart. I mean, you made your own code, for fuck's sake. That has to count for something, Aizawa said encouragingly, his voice softer than it was before. Izuku didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything, and the room was quiet for a moment. Aizawa cleared his throat, changing the subject again. Speaking of, kid, I've been meaning to ask you about that. Your code. Izuku was pulled out of his thoughts, looking up at Aizawa, his brows furrowed. My code? What about it? Well, maybe while you're still recovering, you could teach it to me. It allows you the time to rest, and it could provide it could prove helpful if we both could communicate without the enemy knowing. And that wasn't what Izuku had expected. No one had ever been interested in his code before, let alone expressed any interest in actually learning it. It was odd, but also strangely nice. Of course, I would love to teach you. It might take a while, though. Not that you aren't capable or anything. It's just that I designed it to be pretty much unbreakable. It took me almost 2 years to develop and memorize. Aizawa paused. Did you make this before you were kidnapped? Izuku froze. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing would come out. He sat, gaping like a fish for a solid 30 seconds before finally he found the ability to speak again. Yeah, I made the code. Well, I guess it's a language? I made the language when I was in school. The other kids would get mad at me when I would analyze their quirks, so I had to disguise what I was writing. I was going to put everything in code anyways, because it's kind of dangerous, my analysis, but that's why. I had a lot of free time, too. Izuku trailed off, wishing desperately to move on to another topic. We can dive into your horrible school experience later. I'm sure Nezu would love to destroy another school. Startled, Izuku met Aizawa's gaze, relaxing at his amused expression. I keep thinking you're serious. Your poker face is really good. Aizawa wasn't joking, but Izuku didn't need to know that right now. Grabbing a blank piece of paper and some stray crayons lying nearby, Aizawa dumped them onto Izuku's blanketed lap playfully. Shall we begin? Izuku grinned, throwing a crayon back at Aizawa with a laugh. He was so excited. Everything was going to go great. Well, more or less. After 3 hours of trying to explain the basics of his code to Aizawa, the man was about ready to quit. Kid, you said this was a code. This is the fucking equation for quantum mechanics. Aizawa sighed, looking at the dozens of scribbled out characters in front of him. Very funny. I told you it was going to take some time. Besides, quantum mechanics doesn't have one single equation. It's an entire subfield of physics. Fine. Then this is every single equation for quantum mechanics. Izuku smiled, feeling a little sympathetic. The code, really more of a language, was definitely tricky. It was technically 3 separate languages, all developed by Izuku, that merged together in seemingly random, but carefully calculated places. It was all an elaborate way to throw the reader off, to confuse them. Izuku had made it so intricate as a way to entertain himself, but it kind of spiraled out of control. Just a little bit. This may be a lost cause. That demon tongue looks like how I think a migraine would be written on paper. Laughing, Izuku shoved Aizawa's shoulder gently. Come on, Zawa. I know you can get it. Now, let's start at the beginning. This character means... As Izuku went over his code for what seemed like the 30th time, Aizawa just listened quietly, looking at him fondly, pointedly ignoring the ever-growing headache that had formed at the beginning of the lesson. He had long since given up actually learning the language, but Aizawa was just glad to see the kid so happy. It almost scared him how quickly he had grown attached. Hisashi had always told him he was a softie, but he never really thought so until now. His heart sank a little as he took in the reality of the situation. Izuku had a family. After they got out of this mess, which they would, he would go back to loving parents and friends, and they would part ways. Aizawa reprimanded himself mentally. Of course he would go back to his family. It was a good thing. It was the goal. It's not like Aizawa was his dad or anything. That was ridiculous. A small voice in the back of his head cried out, reminding him that he and Hisashi had been looking to adopt a child for years now. that Izuku was everything they had ever wanted in a kid, that there was obviously something off about the kid's home life. No, he couldn't think like that right now. Couldn't think like that at all. He looked back up at Izuku, the boy still trying to explain his code as he waved his hands around animatedly, his eyes wide and bright. It made him look so painfully young. He was so painfully young. Aizawa nodded a few times, pretending to understand. His head hurt like a bitch, but it was worth the smile on Izuku's face. The excitement in his voice as he talked about something he was passionate about, something he had worked incredibly hard on. This kid would be the death of him. Of that, Aizawa was sure. Chapter 7. Shattered Masks. Summary: Aizawa meets Overhaul. Things go exactly as you would expect. Trigger warnings, mild depictions of violence and torture. As their time in captivity progressed, Izuku and Aizawa developed a routine. In the mornings, after eating, 2 trays of food and some bottles of water were slipped under their door twice a day. The two would stretch and review information. Izuku had long since given up learning Izuku's complex code, so they communicated through Japanese Sign Language, which Izuku had learned before his capture in preparation for his hero career. Aizawa already knew it because his husband was deaf, so it worked out rather well. While Aizawa hadn't found any wires in his searches of the cell, he wanted to be absolutely sure that their plans weren't heard by the enemy. Call him paranoid, but he'd rather be safe than sorry. Aizawa and Izuku discussed the layout of the facility, the parts they had been taken at least, ways to exploit weaknesses of the doctor and his guards, possibly entry and exit points, etc. Izuku gave Aizawa information whenever possible, considering he had been there longer, but there were things the boy wasn't telling him. Times where Izuku would pause, his hands falling to his lap, and his eyes flashing with fear. Aizawa never pushed him. He was just a kid. He didn't deserve to relive the torture he'd already been forced to experience. He was sure that it was important and needed to be talked about eventually, but it could wait. After plotting and scheming, they would begin sparring. Aizawa had shown Izuku some basic moves, focusing on practicality over brute force, how to take a punch, how to fall correctly, how to block properly, and the likes. Now that Izuku was finally in better health, he was able to catch on fairly quickly. He was eager to learn and took to fighting like a sponge to water. Aizawa knew that if Izuku were one of his students at UA, he'd be at the top of the class without a doubt. Aizawa also taught Izuku some stealth tactics, how to walk without being detected, how to hide one's breathing, how to lie with a straight face. While this wasn't what he normally taught his younger students, they were both far from the classroom now. They needed to be stealthy if they ever hoped to escape with their lives. And so, Izuku had to learn. The kid had a little more trouble with these. He could move quietly enough, but he breathed too loudly when he got nervous, and his poker face needed work, to say the least. It took another week or two, but Izuku was making great progress. They would spend as much time training together as they could, interrupted every so often by a guard taking Aizawa, it was only ever Aizawa now, to another examination. He would come back bruised, battered, and slightly scarred, but nothing he couldn't handle. Aizawa had been a pro hero for a while now. Injuries were literally part of the job. Besides, it was nothing in comparison to what Izuku had been through. For whatever reason, they were going easy on Aizawa. Izuku had speculated that the doctor had to run fewer tests because Aizawa had a quirk. It wasn't a comforting thought. At night, after tiring themselves out from sparring and training and scheming, The pair would eat dinner and talk. Izuku usually held most of the conversation, and he was naturally more sociable than Aizawa, but the hero would chip in when appropriate. Sometimes Aizawa would tell old stories about his early days in the field, which always had Izuku looking at him with stars in his eyes. And then he started driving the ATM, the ATM still strapped to the back of his car. It was so loud, I swore I could practically see colors after that. Seriously? How did you catch him? Did you use your capture weapon on the wheels, or disconnect the machine from his car? Or I didn't have to. The dumbass ran into a pole before making it down the street, knocking himself out. That's so cool. Aizawa wasn't usually the one who liked to talk much in general, let alone about himself or his life. But it made the kid happy. Ever since Izuku came back about a month ago, covered in bloody bandages and without the familiar light in his eyes, Aizawa had made it his personal mission to get the kid to laugh at least once a day. It gave him something to focus on, and it ensured that Izuku didn't get completely lost in the darkness that threatened to swallow him. Okay, maybe that was a little dramatic, but seeing Izuku laugh lightened the load on Aizawa's chest significantly. Izuku, however, seemed to have a personal mission of his own. Every night, without fail, he would comb through Aizawa's hair with his hands and put it into a braid of some sorts, chatting about heroes or some random species of bird as he did so. This strange act of intimacy came short after Izuku's week-long torture stint. Something in the kid seemed to break. He'd wake up every night, sobbing, screaming, clutching at his chest, his arms, his neck, reaching to grab his body as if it had been ripped from him in his dreams. Aizawa would rush to his side, not knowing how to help, but moved into action, cradling Izuku in his arms until the sobbing stopped and the tears slowed. Izuku would run his hands through Aizawa's hair without realizing at first, and embarrassingly curl into a ball with his face covered when he realized what he had been doing. Aizawa had sighed, a sad smile on his face, as he dropped the kid's hand back on his head. If it helps you calm down, you can touch my hair, problem child. I don't mind. And that was when their tradition began. Afterwards, any time Izuku had a nightmare, Aizawa would hold him in his arms until he calmed down, and they would sit on the bottom bunk of the bed together, talking in hushed tones as Izuku braided Aizawa's hair with shaky hands. Aizawa would be lying if he said it wasn't nice. He had never let anyone touch his hair before, besides Hisashi's occasional tussle, and it was odd, to say the least. Pleasantly so. It was grounding in the sense that he could feel Izuku's fingers on his scalp, was close enough to hear the boy's heartbeat and slightly uneven breathing. It was confirmation that Izuku was alive, that he was breathing. It helped quell his paranoia, his deep-rooted fear that had been planted when the kid had been dumped back into the cell, barely breathing, and so unbearably cold. He didn't like seeing Izuku in pain, but it was better than the alternative. So that was how they spent their days, scheming, training, talking, constantly soaking up each other's presence, forming a bond only a fool would try to break. It was comfortable, and almost domestic in a sense. They were still in a little prison cell, Aizawa still desperately missed his husband, his job, and his cats. Even bastard. Izuku still struggled with his healing wounds, his unsteady mind. They both had days where getting out of bed seemed impossible, and escaping seemed like a faraway dream. They both got quiet sometimes, pausing to think about what was happening in the outside world. Right now, how much they were missing, if anyone was missing them. Aizawa wondered sometimes, when Izuku was asleep and the room was just too quiet, if his husband was looking for him, or if Hisashi thought he was dead. The thought kept him up at night. But when all of that was put aside, Izuku and Aizawa managed to find comfort in each other. The past month hadn't been horrible, in Aizawa's opinion. The torture had stopped, and he and the kid were making things work in their own messy, jumbled way of surviving. Everything was manageable, stable, at the very least. It should have been a warning. There's always calm before a storm. When Izuku awoke, it was to sore muscles and an aching body. This wasn't unusual, since Aizawa had been pushing him harder in training, but it wasn't very pleasant. He sighed, pushing himself up into a sitting position on his bed to begin the day. Looking over to his right, Izuku was ready to tease Aizawa about his inevitable bedhead. But Aizawa wasn't there. Izuku's heart dropped in his chest. Something wasn't right. Aizawa was always in the same spot when he woke up. The man had stubbornly refused to sleep on the top bunk, muttering something about constant vigilance before moving the flimsy mattress to sit between Izuku and the middle door. Now, though, the mattress was empty. Izuku scrambled out of bed, looking frantically around the room for any sign of the underground hero, but finding none, which only meant one thing. Aizawa was gone. Taken. Izuku's breath picked up, his heart pounding in his ears. Gone. He was gone. It felt like there was static running through his veins, as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning, the room losing focus by the second. Squeezing his eyes shut, Izuku tried to control his breathing. In for 5 seconds, hold for 6, out for 7, 5, 6, 7, just like Aizawa had taught him. He repeated this process until his heart rate had finally steadied. His head clearer than it had been before. Now wasn't the time for panicking, Izuku reminded himself, trying to get his mind in order. He needed to think. Aizawa was gone, taken somewhere, and Izuku didn't know where he was. That alone wasn't completely unusual. The doctor had been taking Aizawa for more visits lately and returning him later and later. What was unusual was when they did this. Aizawa was taken while Izuku was asleep. That had never happened before, and however many months they had been there, questions swarmed Izuku's head, insisting and unceasing. Why when Izuku was asleep? How did they take him without waking Izuku up? Surely the noise would have been enough to wake him. So did they drug him to keep him asleep? Why was this time different? Did the time that they took him hold any significance? Or was it just random? Was this some type of psychological torture for Izuku? Were they torturing Aizawa? Izuku had been muttering while trying to sort through his thoughts, the sound filling the quiet room as he paced back and forth. Why had the doctor been so focused on Aizawa recently? Sure, they had already done plenty of testing on Izuku, but he hadn't been taken for an examination since his meeting with Overhaul. There had to be a reason. Were they doing the same thing to Aizawa that they had done to Izuku? He hoped not. His mind kept drifting back to the peculiarity of the situation. Why did they take Aizawa when they did? The doctor was seemingly always here, so it wasn't an issue with his schedule at least. So why the odd timing? Or better question, whose time were they operating on now? The thought stopped Izuku in his tracks. Of course he knew why. He didn't want it to be true. But it was the only thing that made any fragment of sense in this twisted situation. Aizawa was going to meet Overhaul, and Izuku needed to do something quick. When Aizawa Shoda opened his eyes, he immediately noticed that he wasn't where he was supposed to be. Instead of lying on a flimsy mattress on the ground of his cell, he was strapped to a metal chair, or a table. It was more like a sheet of metal, almost like the planks used by a knife thrower for their volunteers in those old American TV shows Hazashi always made him watch. His arms and legs were strapped tight against his body with thick leather bands, a similar one pinning down his waist, his torso, and his head. Whoever had taken him was being incredibly thorough. Oddly enough, he wasn't in the doctor's usual office. Looking around the shockingly all-white room, he found no one else present. There were, however, desks in neat rows across the room from him, covered in computers, scattered notes, lab equipment, and so on. The room smelled of antiseptic, like it had been cleaned recently. It was unsettlingly quiet, the only noise being the faint whirring of machinery. Aizawa tried to wiggle his arms and legs to see how tightly he was really stuck, and he barely budged an inch. Shit. He could feel the beginning of a headache coming on. He wondered how they even got him here. He didn't remember being taken. He would have put up a fight, especially since, if his last memory proved correct, the kid was asleep. He was never taken when the kid was sleeping, nor would he ever leave the kid without trying to wake him up first. Aizawa wouldn't let him wake up to an empty room. The thought alone had Aizawa shivering. He remembered the feeling of waking up and Izuku being gone, not returning for hours. It was horrible. He could only hope to be reunited with him soon, for both of their sakes. Aizawa was pulled out of his musings by several high-pitched beeping noises, followed by a resounding metallic click. The thick metal door at the far side of the room swung open. That alone was strange to Aizawa. Why the intense security measures? What was so important that it needed to be kept under such heavy-duty locks? As the answer to his questions walked through the door, Aizawa bit back a curse. It all made sense now. Why Izuku had been so frightened after returning to the cell a month ago? Why he was so terrified? He couldn't even talk about what they had done to him. The wounds covering his body, too thin and precise to have been made by hand. It was like he had been torn apart from the inside out with a quirk, then shoved back together again. The reality of the situation hit Aizawa like a sack of bricks, because in walked Chisaki Kai, better known as Overhaul, the leader of the 8 precepts of death. Aizawa had been investigating the man for years because of his involvement with the Yakuza, an organized crime syndicate running rampant throughout Japan. Overhaul was actually the name of his quirk. He could disassemble anything he touches and put it back together again. He was a suspect in dozens of murder cases and had charges ranging from manslaughter to arson to serial kidnapping. Other than his quirk, a list of charges, and some witness descriptions, the police force had next to no information on him. But the descriptions the witnesses provided were always the same. Green jacket with purple fur and a giant bird beak plague mask. He was an eccentric figure, one you couldn't mistake. Aizawa had never met the man before, but he knew from the second he locked eyes with him that this really was Overhaul. His eyes were those of a killer, and Aizawa's instincts were screaming at him to run. Far, far away. His instincts were never wrong. The man entered the room slowly, his gaze fixed on Aizawa. His eyes were full of disapproval. Malice? Aizawa wasn't sure, but whatever it wasn't good. His cold aura watched over the room like a winter chill, and Aizawa had never missed the warm comfort of his capture weapon more than he did right now, hiding his fear, his panic. Aizawa returned Overhaul's glare with one of his own, vicious and biting. He could feel himself slip into his underground mode, his vision sharpening, his walls raising. Aizawa knew how vital it was to separate his emotions from his ability to make logical decisions, to keep a cool head. He didn't have the luxury of feeling anything right now. As much as he wanted to scream at the bastard for hurting his kid, he had to gain the upper hand in the situation, if at all possible. Overhaul. How shit to finally meet you. You look like even more of a scumbag than I was expecting. Aizawa's flat tone gave nothing away, his gaze dismissive and bored. It was a risky move, but the only thing he could think of. A smart mouth and and arrogant attitude pissed villains off to no end. And the angrier someone was, the more likely they were to make a mistake. It showed that Aizawa wasn't scared, wasn't someone who could be controlled, even if he was absolutely terrified, which he definitely wasn't. Not at all. Shoda Aizawa, the displeasure is all mine. I've been waiting to meet you for months, but sadly my schedule has been quite busy. The man's words were clipped, his voice low and dangerous. He looked at Aizawa as if he were a rotting animal, collecting flies on the side of the road. Oh, well, thank you so much for gracing me with your presence. It means the world to finally meet a sickly Victorian peasant in the flesh. It was on my bucket list, you know. Overhaul's eyes darkened. Such a filthy, disgusting mouth. Soon this world will be clean of filth. You're going to help me achieve that. Talk as much as you want about filth. You're no cleaner than I am. The villain let out a long, extended sigh. You're right about that. Filth is unfortunately unavoidable for quirked individuals. He took a step forward, his shoulders straightening, a strange look overtaking his features that had Aizawa's hair standing on end. He didn't like where this was going. But those without quirks are pure. You know, I've met quite a few quirkless individuals in my days. Old and young, brilliant and foolish. They were all clean, beautifully, wonderfully clean. Yet their minds were delicate and their bodies unsuitable, like flowers. They wilted when plucked, and their purity died with them. And then young Izuku came into our world, and our prayers were finally answered. Aizawa grit his teeth, trying to contain his emotions. The bastard had tortured the kid to an inch of his life. Aizawa grit his teeth, trying to contain his emotions. The bastard had tortured his kid to an inch of his life, and still had the audacity to talk about him like he was some sick sacrifice. He said nothing, and Overhaul continued, his voice lighter than before. Yes, Izuku surely is the solution to all of our problems. He was so much nicer to be around than you are. That much is certain. Quieter, too. He just has an air about him, so innocent, so pure. The second I made eye contact with him, I knew he was something special. Rage pulled in Aizawa's stomach. His blood burned beneath his skin. He stayed quiet. He had to stay quiet. The child was terrified, I know, trembling even, like a deer in the headlights, frozen before disaster. His panic was bewitching, but do you know what was even better? Aizawa clenched his fists, tight enough to draw blood. If he weren't tied down, he would have jumped that bastard ages ago. He wanted him to stop talking. Overhaul took another step forward, then another, and another, until he stopped about 2 feet away from Aizawa, far too close for his liking. The man's voice was barely above a whisper now, his eyes glinting in delight. Even better were his screams when I ripped his body apart, over and over again. They were beautiful, like an angel singing to me from heaven. Even his blood was clean and pure. A growl escaped Aizawa's throat as he lurched forward in his restraints, teeth snapping at Overhaul, face darkening with anger. Shut the fuck up. Overhaul laughed in his face. It was an ugly sound, almost like a shrieking pelican. It didn't suit the man. So the cold-hearted Eraserhead has a soft spot for the quirkless child. How peculiar. Although I don't blame you. Izuku is quite fascinating. His genetic makeup is fundamentally different from you and I's. It made putting him back together quite the challenge. How is he doing, by the way? Is he still in shock? Dying will do that to a person, especially a child. I hope I didn't break him too badly. I need him intact for my research. Aizawa had to fight to keep himself from breaking down entirely. He knew what Overhaul was was trying, hell, succeeding to do. Hearing about how Izuku was tortured, how he had been killed, was tearing him apart. You touch him again, and I'll rip you to shreds with my bare hands. Aizawa's threat, primal and dangerous, would have had any normal person shaking in their boots. Unfortunately, Overhaul was far from normal. And how do you plan on doing that? You couldn't even hurt me if you wanted to, Eraserhead. You're defenseless, weak. I've already injured your precious boy. I killed him. Again and again and again. You know, he was conscious the entire time, since I was remaking his brain constantly. He didn't have the ability to pass out. All he could feel was pain, I'm sure. Overhaul leaned back for a moment, observing Aizawa with blazing eyes. Imagine how it felt to be ripped apart like that, every nerve made fresh, sensitive to any little touch, each cut and tear. With a slow and precise motion, he unbuckled the clasp on his glove. Well, I suppose you won't have to mention anything. You'll get to know exactly how it felt. Aizawa struggled to breathe, his chest heavy, his pulse frantic. A feeling of suffocating helplessness washed over him like a tsunami, drowning him in depths he knew he couldn't escape from. Overhaul was right. He couldn't do anything. He could only watch as Izuku was hurt again and again. Watch as the light in the kid's eyes faded with every passing day. Watch as the doctor performed his relentless examinations. Watch as Overhaul reached forward with an ungloved hand and ripped Aizawa apart. Taking apart a human body and putting it back together in the span of a few seconds was a delicate yet messy business. Overhaul enjoyed inflicting pain, of course, but he quite disliked how filthy things often got in the process. Blood stained the floor, bits of flesh and bones and fat disintegrated beneath his very touch. There was screaming and crying and silence, and then more screaming and crying. It got old quickly, but Overhaul didn't dirty his hands for nothing. By understanding, deconstructing, and reconstructing Eraserhead's physical form, he was able to locate, segregate, and pick apart the man's quirk factor. Overhaul rebuilt Eraserhead again, searching for the right piece, the part of his quirk that would be transferable to his research. The lab's door flung open, and Overhaul's concentration was broken. A technician staggered forward, his face red and breathing labored. Sir, I'm sorry to disrupt you, but there's been a disturbance. Slowly, Overhaul turned away from his work to face the man that had disrupted him. The room fell deathly quiet. What could be so important to warrant such an interruption? His voice rang out. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. The scientist grew pale, his eyes wide. It's 139B, sir, the man stuttered. He's engaged in a standoff with the doctor. Code red. He's demanding that Eraserhead is returned to the cell. Overhaul was quiet for a moment, considering his options. He looked to Eraserhead, now covered in blood, thin wounds swirling their way around the entirety of his body. It was a disgusting sight. It wasn't ideal, but he supposed he's gotten enough data already. Besides, he had other matters to tend to. Get Eraserhead cleaned up and bandaged. In the meantime, I'll pay the boy a visit myself. The scientist nodded furiously, too scared to speak, before leaving to find another set of hands to help his work. Wiping the blood from his hands, Overhaul put his gloves back on, snapping the buckle into place. He refused to be covered in blood while in the presence of a child. After all, it was just inconsiderate. Alright, everyone, that's the end of Chapter 6 and 7 of Your Presence is a Dream in This Godforsaken Nightmare. I'll get back to you guys with Chapter 8 and 9 tomorrow, probably, hopefully. I'm sorry if I stuttered or couldn't speak very well during that. Throughout this freaking reading, I found out I'm still congested. So, yeah, it was really hard to speak and my throat was very clogged and I could I just really wanted to blow my nose, but I couldn't. Anyways, I'm gonna go do that now. Have a fantastic day, everyone, and make sure to drink coffee or water by Aizawa for life suggestion.